Hello everyone. We're here today to talk about Nintex workflow design tips, specifically how to incorporate social network interaction into your workflows, and also on how to get some external financial data incorporated into your workflows. This will highlight some new developments that we're doing with Nintex workflow and cloud-related investments. So, first off, this is a presentation, a webinar that will involve as little PowerPointing as humanly possible. With that, let's go immediately to demo land in order to get things done. So exit out of demo land, get back into a virtual machine. Let's start working at things. I have a solution here that involves knowledge base articles. They're prepared in draft mode in a particular SharePoint site. And when they're done, we want to publish them to this external public-facing site, which currently has nothing in it. And we're going to use a workflow to do that. It's not a very complicated workflow. In fact, it's a fairly simple workflow. It's one simple approval step. It's a flexi task. It'll go to either an approve branch or a reject branch. If it's approved, we use the copy to SharePoint action in order to push it to this particular URL. If the item is already there, we'll rename the new one, so we'll add a unique value to the end of it or something to that effect. We'll copy the metadata along as well. So far, so good. Here's the wrinkle. We want to tell the world that it's available once it's available. And towards that end, we need to do, well, a little bit extra. In fact, what I think I want to do is tweet the world about this. So, there are a couple of ways we could access Twitter. The easiest way that might come to mind is to go ahead and go to the integration tab, and since it's a RESTful web service, to go ahead and add a web request. But you know something? We're not going to do that. I'm going to use something that is brand spanking new, and I'll tell you where it comes from in just a minute. Let's just use it and work backwards from the end of the story. There is this magic little thing that's called Twitter Status Update. Let's drag and drop it into position and configure it. And it really only wants two pieces of information. Who's going to tell it which Twitter account to use? I will make that the initiator. You want to post this, you get to tweet this. And what's the message going to be? The status update. Well, first thing I'm going to do, since I'm going to use my real Twitter account, I start with ignore this. Say new KB, and throw in the URL to the new item. Now, when we publish that to the external site, we're keeping a copy. The result of that is the location of the new document. So I'm going to use that and just tweet it. So far, so good. In fact, I'm going to publish this workflow with that new functionality built into it. Publish like the wind, and you have indeed published nice and quickly. Thank you very much. All right, let's execute this. I'll come here, refresh the page for a second because I had set this workflow to automatically create a menu item. And away we go. As with any declarative workflow, the very first time it gets executed after being freshly published, there is an extra moment or two during which it gets just-in-time compiled. After that, it's nice and fast, and even this isn't going to take more than a moment or two. Now, a couple of things are going to happen almost immediately. In fact, I will come over here to my mailbox and prepare to receive a request indicating that there's this new knowledge base article called Avoid Running with Scissors, sound advice, and click here to respond to the task of approving it for publication or not. I will approve it. Click OK, and away we go. All right, so far so good. I'm going to delete this message so we don't get confused later. Now, you may be asking yourself, why did he go ahead and go to some special Twitter status update thing when a call web service type functionality, be it using SOAP or REST, would have been perfectly fine? Well, it would have been perfectly fine, except for the fact that that opinion's based on an assumption that's not necessarily valid, because all web services are not alike. Here's how we often think that it works. And you know something? It usually does, especially with web services created inside a corporate firewall. You have a web service consumer, a client if you would, although in this case the consumer is a server, and it's going to call a web service that lives somewhere else. The expectation is you send out a request and you get back an immediate response with what you want. In theory, it does work like this, except that a lot of the time, especially with web services that live in the cloud, it gets more complicated. Specifically, and this is exactly how Twitter works, they take a never give up approach. Twitter is very robust. It just resets itself when anything goes wrong, and they have Twitter clients just try again in case it's too busy or clogged up or something's hiccuping. So it looks a little bit like this. Send out a request. It may get returned with a failure code. As long as that failure code says you're not authorized or something like that, every Twitter client out there worth anything will then go ahead and attempt to retry the request, to retweet if you would, in which case it may fail again. It's okay. Try several times, not too many times, but enough times, and eventually your response will go through. This is the never give up approach. This is probably not what you want to code into your workflow, all those retry attempts and so on. Not a lot of fun. You would probably like it to behave like that previous one where it's one request, one response. We don't blame you. By the way, other services out there, not Twitter, but some of the other ones, we can support these, use a take a number approach. So in other words, you're supposed to check back from time to time. You send out a request. You don't get an immediate response. You get back an immediate token or ticket, a number if you would, that you're supposed to use periodically to check and see if anything is ready for you. Eventually you send it back and something is ready and it gets sent back to you. You need to deal with that kind of logic. And I'm guessing you'd prefer not to do that inside your workflow either, and I don't blame you. Still other cloud-hosted web services out there take yet another approach, which is a don't call us, we'll call you approach. First thing you're supposed to do as the consumer is set up your own web service to receive a callback message when everything is done. And then when you send out a request, you include information on how to call you back with the answer. The web service gets that and says, thank you very much, takes its sweet time, takes as long as it needs, and when it's good and ready, it sends back the delayed response to the callback service. All of these are perfectly legitimate ways to do web service work. None of these, other than that first example with a simple request response, is very workflow friendly. That's okay. That's, in fact, extremely okay. We don't mind that in the slightest. We are happy to work with any kind of paradigm the world wants to throw us. So, this looks like a send out a request, get back a response. And what I'm expecting to see here is, sure enough, we sent out a request, and it's being interrupted for a second. And this is the second dimension to dealing with cloud-hosted web services. A lot of them have extra secure authentication and authorization schemes. Specifically in the case of Twitter, you don't send your username and password along with your status update or your tweet information. What you're supposed to do is register with Twitter and get an authentication token, and then you send that along. And the authentication token in question, well, I'll show you. It looks like this. This is a test environment. We haven't switched on the real service yet. But when we do, which is in about 2 weeks during Microsoft TechEd North America, it'll immediately go to this page. Now, this page is actually provided by Twitter, not by us. See up here, api.twitter.com. And what it's going to do is use a public protocol called OAuth, Open Authentication. And now it wants Twitter, and only Twitter, wants my username and password, which I will provide it. And what it's saying is this application will be able to, i.e. this application, Intex Live Status Update, will be able to read tweets, see who I follow, update my profile, and post tweets on my behalf. It will not be able to see my Twitter password. I'm okay with that. If I don't want to do this authorization step every single time, we can cache it. What will not be cached is my username and password. What gets cached is a secret number, or a pair of secret numbers that specifically authorize this workflow to act on my behalf with Twitter. It's useless by any other app. It's useless for any other user. It's useless for any other service but Twitter. It's a nice way of doing things. It's called OAuth. Everyone should use it. OAuth is a beautiful thing. All right. Because I have now authorized Twitter to, or my workflow to interact with Twitter on my behalf, it should be going out and taking care of this. We've thought of all these things. And remember, if I authorize it once, I don't need to do this again. So look at this. Here is my update here. Ignore this. New knowledge base article. Avoid running with scissors. Great. Now here's the thing. I don't want people to actually click on this link. So I'm deleting this right here, right now. Great. In a few moments, I should probably receive a status update that said, yep, your tweet went through. Enjoy. In fact, there it is. Knowledge base article was approved, and it went up to the right place. Great. I love that. I love it when a plan comes together. Now, you're probably asking yourself, where did this workflow get this little thing that says Twitter status update? Did we just start adding a whole bunch of binary objects down into a SharePoint environment? The answer is no. The environment looks a little bit like this. Notice how there's, in my design surface, there's something here called Nintex Live. And in fact, if you want to do this from SharePoint Central Administration and you go to Manage Allowed Actions, you get the exact same thing. Here's all the actions that are possible and this little thing called Catalog. So here's what's going on. If I click on this link, by the way, if you're in Central Admin and you don't want individual users to be able to do this, you can take this privilege away so that only admins can do this. Think of it as browsing through a catalog or a library card catalog and pulling out the books you want. So here we have some that are provided by Bing for flight status, language detection, translation. Here's a Facebook status update. Here are specific things we wrote for doing remote access to given SharePoint sites. There's a whole bunch of stuff here. In fact, these are the ones that are globally available. You can have some that are region specific. I'm in Seattle right now doing this webinar, but this server that I'm remote controlling is in Australia. So when we go to region-specific things, there are some Australian business and demographic data sources that are available there. If I were remote controlling a local server, I would see some that are specific to the United States. So in any case, if I want to use any of these, it's really nothing more than, let's go Bing flight status. What? Oh, I didn't really want to remove it. That's okay. Let's go ahead and add language detection and click OK. So it'll update my repertoire of actions, and sure enough, there we go. There's the language detector. I can go ahead and add that anytime I want. These are not code. In fact, let me show you exactly what's going on here. An architectural diagram is probably not a bad thing at this stage of the game. So here it is. Normal Nintex Workflow 2010 on-premise. We add a tiny little bit of code to that called the Nintex Live connector for Nintex Workflow 2010. It's one little piece of code, and its sole function in life is to communicate with Nintex Live over Windows Communication Foundation. Nintex Live is a service we host inside of Microsoft Windows Azure. Azure is a beautiful, beautiful thing. We created a service that scales automatically, that queues information automatically, that authenticates automatically, and all of that plumbing we get from Azure. We just needed to write very clever logic. So the job of Nintex Live, actually it has several jobs, but the first job of Nintex Live is to provide a whole bunch of extra cloud-hosted services to Nintex Workflow and make all those cloud services look like workflow activities. So these communication messages, the requests and responses, they're all queued, they're all tightly authenticated, they traverse firewalls very, very nicely. There's a queue manager, there's a catalog that gets presented. The UI for configuring an activity comes from the cloud. The UI for browsing through available activities, that's provided by the cloud. The actual execution of the methods certainly happens in the cloud. We can register a lot of different Nintex Live services. Some of them provide the functionality they're supposed to do all by themselves. Others are effectively wrappers for external web services that have no idea what Nintex Workflow is. That's okay with us. And we can communicate with those external services, again, using the one request, one response technique, the keep trying until it works technique, or the take a number technique. And pretty soon, we'll also be able to do the don't call us, we'll call you technique. But we've already thought through the details for adding wrappers for services or provide built-in services that do social media updates and request travel information or language translation or exchange rates or transfer files back and forth or access and manipulate remote SharePoint sites. On the way from us and partners, extra services that get snapped into Nintex Live that can do still other things. It's a whole bunch of infrastructure out there, but the goal of that infrastructure is for you to never notice it. All you're supposed to see is a catalog of cool stuff. And if we did that, we did our job. We will make getting any of those complex services out there look like a simple request response. All right, I showed you one demo. Now I want to do that and show you a different demo. Remember, we were talking about doing social networking, but we were also talking about incorporating financial data into a workflow. So let's do that. I have here some expense reports, and the expense reports they're in Excel. There are a couple of cells that are named ranges in Excel that we are binding to document properties, and then we're using property promotion so we can quickly lift the total and the currency and make those available to SharePoint without doing anything fancy. So far, so good. Now, let's build a workflow to approve these. And I've already built the workflow. The part I'm going to demonstrate is what we do with the workflow. So the first thing we do is set a variable to equal, or a field on the item to equal unknown, so we don't know what its approval status is. First thing we do is ask this user's manager. The second thing we do is check and see if the total amount is over $1,000 or over 1,000. And if it is, then we need a secondary approval from someone else. Now, so far so good, except we're forgetting something. One, this is looking at the value of a list column called total. Well, that total doesn't take into account currency differences. And if the corporate policy is $1,000 or more, secondary approval required, but it's a global company and the manager is going to approve it in local currency, we need to convert the figure into US dollars before we do this test. Well, that's all right. Yet one more of these Nintex Live activities is the StrikeIron. StrikeIron's a company that provides a lot of cloud-hosted services. By the way, a lot of these services that we're exposing in Nintex Live come from what used to be called Dallas, what is now known as Windows Azure Marketplace. So here's the StrikeIron currency converter service. Let's go ahead and configure this. It's not particularly daunting. This is again, all this UI you see, it comes from the cloud. We'll cache it locally until we notice that it's been changed. So the amount to convert, that will look up from the request, and there is a column called total. The currency, the input currency, we're not going to use a hard-coded value. We're going to grab that directly out of the item too. That's called currency. So far so good. The output currency, again, we haven't turned this on. It goes, we turn this on and start making it available on an invitation basis in a couple of weeks. Right now, we're still working out one or two of the final beta kinks, And one of them is that this list is being provided alphabetically by the currency abbreviation, not by the name of the country. So UAE shows up first because the three-letter abbreviation begins with an A. There we go, United States. And now we need my StrikeIron username and password. StrikeIron doesn't use OAuth. It wants you to feed a username and password with every request. I'm not super keen on that, but that's okay. In order to make sure everything stays encrypted, I've put the username and password we're supposed to use inside of workflow constants. And as of Nintex Workflow 2010 version 2.2, it is now possible to store constants in a secure way, meaning that only certain user IDs or certain workflow designers can see, let alone use those constants. I need to bring back the converted amount, and I need to put it somewhere. I've already got a variable waiting for it called total US dollars. So far, so good. I also need to, here where I do the test, no longer test the current item total field. I need to look up the, yep, I do want to change this. Good. It's the workflow data item called total in US dollars that I want to compare to 1,000. Now we're cooking. Let's submit. Let's publish. And as soon as this comes back and says it's published, I love it when a plan comes together. Hey, by the way, if you want to know why it's publishing so quickly, I'll show you. Not everybody knows about this. There is a checkbox here called Publish Without Validation. This is a very quick sidebar. If you don't check this, SharePoint will revalidate the workflow model at publish time. What a lot of people don't realize is that as you design a workflow, we're validating it constantly already. If you trust us to validate it, check this checkbox. The publish of a workflow will go much, much faster. That's one of the reasons this is happening so quickly. That's a quick sidebar. Ignore it if it doesn't make sense. Okay, let's go submit an expense report. Whoops, I republished that workflow, so I do need to refresh the screen. There we go. Start. And away we go. Again, we just updated it, so there will be a moment to just-in-time compile it, but any second now, I should see an email arrive in my mailbox asking me if I really wouldn't mind very much approving this expense report. I will say, of course I don't mind doing that. By the way, yes, I did submit the request, and yes, I am approving it. In Active Directory, I've set myself up as my own manager. I didn't want to have to monitor multiple mailboxes for this. All right, now let's go ahead and monitor this workflow's progress. So if I come here to view workflow history, this is the instance of this that is running at the moment, and my suspicion is it's in the middle of looking that stuff up. All right, that's fine. This will take a moment or two, but when it finishes, I should come back here to my mailbox and see a secondary request. And since I really don't know how much time it's going to take, it's probably not a good idea for us to hang around and watch, but I will come back and look in just a minute. The way you'll know whether or not this worked properly is in my mailbox, one of two things will happen. I will either see an email saying it was approved, in which case this didn't work, or you'll see an email saying we need a secondary approval. We'll come back and check on this. I have two slides I want to show you before we go into Q&A. I see we've got 1 solid minute left. So let's jump back over to PowerPoints. We'll come back here during Q&A just to prove a point. But here we go. Availability of this Nintex Live service. Notice I'm calling it a service. It's not a separate product. If you're not using Nintex Workflow, this is not very interesting because it is a co-pilot, a cloud-hosted co-pilot for Nintex Workflow. It makes Nintex Workflow better by adding lots and lots of capabilities without adding lots and lots of code. What's more, we will evolve this on internet time, so we can add features and new capabilities to Nintex Live at any time without affecting anything you're doing in your local SharePoint environment. We'll version the old versions of services in case we add new capabilities to existing services, or we can add new services entirely. All of that works. We're turning it on later this month. It'll be invitation only at first, and we'll grow the amount of Azure hosted resources that we consume. If you want to request an invitation, just hit nintex.com/live to request such a thing. We'd be absolutely happy to honor those requests. And in terms of how lots of people are asking how we're going to monetize this. The answer is as little as possible. We'll make our money in two ways. Technique number one is this is something that will make Nintex workflow more valuable and more people will buy it. So we don't really want to charge much, if anything, for Nintex Live's infrastructure. We will also provide certain services through Nintex Live that we will charge for. We aren't doing so yet, but we will at some point. Just like StrikeIron, for example, will charge you a certain amount of money for every time it's a tiny amount of money, like pennies, every time you do an exchange rate calculation or something to that effect. We might create something that a service that you pay for, we'll charge for that. But just to be connected to Nintex Live, if anything, we'll charge a tiny amount of money just to recover our costs for offering the infrastructure in the first place. And that'll probably be tied to software assurance or something to that effect. We want every man, woman, and child with access to Nintex workflow to use Nintex Live. Make no mistake. So this is not something we're going to charge a bunch of money for. So yes, it'll make the workflow product more valuable. It will make, and we'll provide some services through it that are for a fee. All right, so that's that. Ask more questions. I'm about to deal with questions in a moment. But that's pretty much that. Now, before I go on to Q&A and check back on the status of that running demo, next month we'll have yet another public webinar on Nintex Workflow Design Tips, and that one will be all about employee onboarding processes or employee hiring processes and document assembly techniques. That'll be presented by my colleague Eben Illingworth, and you can find out more information about it by going to nintex.com/events. And with that, now is a fine time to jump over to Q&A land. But again, as a backdrop to Q&A, let's go back here. Oh, hey, look at this. Another response is required. Because the following expense report exceeded $1,000, a secondary approval is required, and thus a task has been assigned to you regarding this item. Why, yes, I don't mind approving this at all. I love it when a plan comes together. And there we go. Okay. And there it is, approved. Yay! Okay, that's pretty much it.